Monks dried wet fabric inside stone buildings in the dampest climates in Europe for centuries. The mold never came. In the 1950s, the dryer industry told American households that hanging clothes indoors was unreliable and embarrassing, and subdivisions made it illegal. The knowledge that eliminated mold without a single product was set aside in 1 decade. The monks never set it aside. Their laundry rooms still work. By the 1950s, the automatic dryer had moved from luxury to expectation. Appliance manufacturers spent the post-war decade persuading American households that line drying was inconvenient, unreliable, and mildly embarrassing. And subdivisions backed them up by passing ordinances against outdoor clotheslines. Indoor drying racks quietly disappeared from hardware catalogs. The knowledge of how to move air through a home deliberately, how to position textiles for maximum evaporation, how to sequence drying to prevent humidity buildup, all of it got set aside as the appliance market reshaped what households were expected to own. Monasteries kept using it, not out of poverty, not out of stubbornness, but because it worked and they had no reason to replace what worked. The same institutions that preserve Latin manuscripts and fermentation traditions also preserve the entirely unglamorous knowledge of how to dry fabric without heat damage and without creating the damp conditions that feed mold. The mold treatment industry, with its sprays and foggers and professional remediation services, is a consequence of that lost knowledge, not a solution to anything. It addresses the symptom of homes that trap moisture without the airflow to resolve it. And that is not inevitable. That is a design failure, and it is one that monasteries never made. The modern assumption is that drying requires heat, but the accurate principle is that drying requires vapor pressure differential, which is the difference between the moisture level in the fabric and the moisture level in the surrounding air. Heat accelerates that differential, but it is not the only way to create it. 3 mechanisms drove the monastic drying system. Moving air continuously removes the thin layer of saturated air that forms against wet fabric, because without movement that layer sits there and evaporation stalls. And that is physics, not folklore. When ambient humidity runs lower than the humidity locked in the textile, water molecules migrate outward with no heat required. And monasteries maintained this gradient by ventilating continuously, not dramatically, not with machines, but with windows and doors positioned to create reliable cross drafts. Stone walls and thick plaster absorb and release heat slowly, stabilizing room temperature in a way that prevents the condensation cycles that deposit moisture on walls and fabric, which is the same principle behind wine cellars, root cellars, and the cold stone corridors of every monastery you have ever seen photographed. Mold needs moisture to colonize, and it needs surfaces that stay damp. A room with continuous airflow and stable temperatures does not produce those surfaces, so the mold has nowhere to establish itself. The system ran in zones, each one serving a specific purpose in the drying sequence. Zone 1 involves shaking textiles vigorously before hanging, not once but several times, because shaking separates fabric layers, removes excess trapped water mechanically, and creates initial airflow contact across the entire surface. A folded or clumped garment traps humid air inside, while a shaken open garment begins evaporating from both sides immediately. Zone 2 covered hanging orientation, where heavy items like sheets, wool blankets, and thick towels got hung so their thickest seams and hems faced into the primary airflow path. Because the densest part of a textile holds the most water and dries slowest, and orienting it into the draft cuts drying time in the section most likely to mold. Airflow moves in a direction, and monks worked with that direction rather than hanging items out of habit. Zone 3 held the spacing rule, which required that no 2 items touch, because contact points between fabrics create zones of stalled air, and a towel pressed against a shirt at the shoulder will not fully dry at that contact point. Zone 4 introduced a rotation schedule where items moved at set intervals, often morning and mid-afternoon, repositioned to expose new surfaces to the primary draft, because gravity and airflow together pull moisture to the lowest point of a hanging item, and rotation redistributes that accumulated moisture back into evaporation. Monasteries built that intervention into the daily schedule the way they built in prayer hours. Zone 5 created a dedicated low opening or cracked window on the opposite wall from the main air entry point, because without an exit, humid air circulates and saturates the room rather than leaving it. Air management is not about the quantity of air moving through a space. It is about direction, and one intentional exit point outperforms 3 randomly cracked windows every time. In high humidity coastal regions, ambient air may not provide sufficient vapor pressure differential on certain days without supplemental dehumidification. In winter climates, outdoor air brought indoors may be dry enough to work exceptionally well, or cold enough to require warming before it moves humidity effectively. The system is real, the physics is real, and the application requires attention to your specific environment. But the real question is how much of the mold treatment you have bought over the years never needed to exist in the first place. Here is where to begin, and none of it requires a renovation or a purchase. Start by identifying your home's natural draft path on a mild day with a window open at each end, because feeling where air moves through that corridor costs nothing and reveals your primary drying zone, and a bedroom with cross-ventilation from 2 exterior walls serves this purpose better than any laundry room with a single vent. Place a wooden drying rack in that corridor, positioned so hanging items face the airflow rather than the wall, and that becomes the first version of Zones 2 and 3 combined. Whatever you are currently hanging anywhere in your home, create 2 inches of clearance between every item today, because that single change reduces mold risk at contact points without any other modification. Find the window or vent on the opposite side of your natural draft and open it a reliable 2 inches whenever drying is underway, which creates the directional flow that turns a stagnant room into a working system. Set a reminder for 3 hours after you hang anything substantial, because moving items, flipping towels, and reorienting sheets takes 90 seconds, and skipping that step is the difference between a system that dries textiles and one that merely stores them in suspended dampness. The monk who designed that laundry room was not working from primitive instinct. He understood airflow and vapor and surface area in ways that produced 0 mold remediation costs over the lifetime of the building. That knowledge was not lost. It was set aside when something more profitable replaced it. Drop your state in the comments and tell me what your setup looks like if you have used a drying rack, a clothesline, or a deliberate ventilation strategy in your home. And share what you have noticed about mold in the spaces where you dry textiles versus the spaces where you do not. Next week, I'm going to show you the exact monastery floor washing system that prevented bacterial growth for centuries without a single commercial disinfectant. The formula runs to 4 ingredients. The process takes less time than a standard mop routine, and the floors it leaves behind hold up longer between treatments than surfaces cleaned with what is sitting under your sink right now.